other side of the bed, the wife's chair stood empty. At the moment when her husband had interrupted the reading, she had drawn back behind the bedhead, out of his sight. Supporting herself against the wall, she stood there in hiding, her eyes fastened in hungering suspense on the manuscript in Mr. Neal's hand. In a minute more the silence was broken again by Mr. Armadale. "Where is she?" he asked, looking angrily at his wife's empty chair. The doctor pointed to the place. She had no choice but to come forward. She came slowly and stood before him. "You promised to go when I told you," he said. "Go now." Mr. Neal tried hard to control his hand as it kept his place between the leaves of the manuscript, but it trembled in spite of him. A suspicion which had been slowly forcing itself on his mind while he was reading became a certainty when he heard those words. From one revelation to another the letter had gone on, until it had now reached the brink of a last disclosure to come. At that brink the dying man had predetermined to silence the reader's voice before he had permitted his wife to hear the narrative read. There was the secret which the son was to know in after years, and which the mother was never to approach. From that resolution his wife's tenderest pleadings had never moved him an inch, and now from his own lips his wife knew it. She made no answer. She stood there and looked at him, looked her last entreaty, perhaps her last farewell. His eyes gave her back no answering glance. They wandered from her mercilessly to the sleeping boy. She turned speechless from the bed. Without a look at the child, without a word to the two strangers breathlessly watching her, she kept the promise she had given, and in dead silence left the room. There was something in the manner of her departure which shook the self-possession of both the men who witnessed it. When the door closed on her, they recoiled instinctively from advancing farther in the dark. The doctor's reluctance was the first to express itself. He attempted to obtain the patient's permission to withdraw until the letter was completed. The patient refused. Mr. Neal spoke next at greater length and to more serious purpose. "The doctor is accustomed in his profession," he began, "and I am accustomed in mine, to have the secrets of others placed in our keeping. But it is my duty, before we go farther, to ask if you really understand the extraordinary position which we now occupy towards one another. You have just excluded Mrs. Armadale, before our own eyes, from a place in your confidence, and you are now offering that same place to two men who are total strangers to you." "Yes," said Mr. Armadale, "because you are strangers." Few as the words were, the inference to be drawn from them was not of a nature to set distrust at rest. Mr. Neal put it plainly into words. "You are in urgent need of my help and of the doctor's help," he said. "Am I to understand, so long as you secure our assistance, that the impression which the closing passages of this letter may produce on us is a matter of indifference to you?" "Yes. I don't spare you. I don't spare myself. I do spare my wife." "You force me to a conclusion, sir, which is a very serious one," said Mr. Neal. "If I am to finish this letter under your dictation, I must claim permission, having read aloud the greater part of it already, to read aloud what remains, in the hearing of this gentleman as a witness." "Read it." Gravely doubting, the doctor resumed his chair. Gravely doubting, Mr. Neal turned the leaf and read the next words. "There is more to tell before I can leave the dead man to his rest. I have described the finding of his body, but I have not described the circumstances under which he met his death. He was known to have been on deck when the yacht's boats were seen approaching the wreck, and he was afterwards missed in the confusion caused by the panic of the crew. At that time the water was 5 feet deep in the cabin and was rising fast. There was little doubt of his having gone down into that water of his own accord. The discovery of his wife's jewel box close under him on the floor explained his presence in the cabin. He was known to have seen help approaching, and it was quite likely that he had thereupon gone below to make an effort at saving the box. It was less probable, though it might still have been inferred, that his death was the result of some accident in diving, which had for the moment deprived him of his senses. But a discovery by the yacht's crew pointed straight to a conclusion which struck the men one and all with the same horror. When the course of their search brought them to the cabin, they found the scuttle bolted and the door locked on the outside. Had someone closed the cabin, not knowing he was there? Setting the panic-stricken condition of the crew out of the question, there was no motive for closing the cabin before leaving the wreck. But one other conclusion remained. Had some murderous hand purposely locked the man in and left him to drown as the water rose over him? Yes, a murderous hand had locked him in and left him to drown. That hand was mine. The Scotchman started up from the table. The doctor shrank from the bedside. The two looked at the dying wretch, mastered by the same loathing, chilled by the same dread. He lay there with the child's head on his breast, abandoned by the sympathies of man, accursed by the justice of God. He lay there in the isolation of Cain and looked back at them. End of Prologue, Chapter 3, Part 2.